In that house where time seemed to have stopped, only the boy grew in silence. The new presence arrived with no promises, carrying more losses than hopes. But just one look between them was enough for something to connect in a way no one could explain. And when the first word almost formed, it wasn't reason that understood. It was affection. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. Ryan Miller always believed that true love was something you built with. Your own two hands, brick by brick, effort by effort. He wasn't the kind of man who waited for fate to knock on his door. He was the type to wake up before sunrise and go to sleep long after the moon was high in the sky, always with Jessica, his partner in every battle, by his side. Together they started with practically nothing, just a small rented office in downtown Stamford, Connecticut, and an idea that seemed bigger than both of them. He, with a business degree from a state university, worked during the day and studied at night. She, a talented accountant, juggled spreadsheets and bills while dreaming of the day they wouldn't have to worry about every single penny spent. The first few years were a time of absolute sacrifice. Late nights putting together presentations for potential clients, entire weekends hunched over contracts and business proposals, lunches replaced by hurried sandwiches between meetings. But they had each other, and that was enough. When the first big contract finally came through, it was as if the universe had finally decided to reward them for all their dedication. The company began to grow, employees were hired, and clients multiplied. Within 5 years, Ryan and Jessica moved out of the small office and into their own modern headquarters with a view of Cove Island Park. The life they had designed together was becoming a reality. With professional success came the fulfillment of another dream, their own home. It wasn't an over-the-top mansion, but it was spacious and elegant, with a garden where Jessica dreamed of planting rose bushes and a backyard where Ryan pictured their future child playing. When she found out she was pregnant, it was as if all the years of hard work had found their true purpose. The news was met with tears of joy, tight hugs, and a sense of completeness that no million-dollar contract had ever provided. They spent the next 9 months preparing the nursery, choosing every detail with obsessive care, discussing names over romantic dinners, and imagining what it would be like to hold their child in their arms for the first time. Lucas was born on a September morning, just as the first hints of autumn began to color Stamford with their flowers. The delivery was smooth, and when Ryan heard his son's first cry, he felt his life had been completed, in a way he never thought possible. Jessica, exhausted but radiant, held the little one against her chest and whispered words of love that only the three of them shared in that sacred moment. The once quiet house was filled with life. There were a baby's cries in the middle of the night, tired laughter when Lucas made funny faces, and visits from friends and family who brought gifts and unsolicited advice. The routine was chaotic, but it was the most perfect kind of mess. Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper who had been with them since their days in the small apartment, watched it all with a maternal smile. She was over 60, but she had more than enough energy to help with the baby, prepare meals, and keep the house in order, while Ryan and Jessica tried to balance their expanding company with the demands of a newborn. Over the years, she had become much more than an employee. She was part of the family, a witness to every achievement, a support in every challenge. But their happiness, as solid as it seemed, was about to be tested in the cruelest way. When Lucas was just 8 months old, Jessica began to feel a different kind of tired. It wasn't the normal exhaustion of a new mother, but something deeper, more worrying. At first, she tried to ignore it, blaming it on the demanding routine of caring for the baby while still handling some responsibilities at the company. Ryan insisted she get more rest, but Jessica was stubborn, saying everything was fine, that it was just a phase. Until one afternoon, while trying to lift Lucas from his crib, she felt a weakness in her legs and had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Ryan took her to the doctor immediately. The tests began, the appointments with specialists, the sleepless nights waiting for results. The diagnosis, when it came, was devastating. A serious, silent illness that had progressed further than anyone wanted to admit. The doctors talked about treatments, possibilities, and hope, but there was something in their eyes that Ryan couldn't ignore. Jessica, always strong, decided to fight with everything she had. She went through exhausting treatment sessions, faced the side effects with a courage that broke the hearts of those who loved her, but always kept a smile on her face whenever she held Lucas. Ryan tried to stay strong. During the day, he ran the company with the same determination as always, hiding the personal drama he was living from clients and employees. At night, he would sit by Jessica's bed, holding her hand, telling her stories about the future they would still build together, about the trips they would take when she got better, about how they would teach Lucas to walk, to talk, to be a good man. She would smile, squeeze his hand back, but deep down, they both knew they were fighting against something bigger than them. On a quiet March morning, just days before Lucas's first birthday, Jessica simply didn't wake up. She had slept peacefully through the night, with no apparent pain, no agony. It was as if she had chosen to leave in the gentlest way possible, sparing those she loved from even greater suffering. Ryan found her in the morning, looking as if she were just resting deeply, and it took him long minutes to accept that this peace was final. The funeral was a small affair, with only close friends and family. Ryan went through it all as if in a trance, holding Lucas in his arms during the service, unable to fully process what was happening. When he finally returned home and found the empty bedroom, the deafening silence, that's when reality hit him with full force. The woman who had been his partner in absolutely everything, who had dreamed alongside him, who had given birth to his son, was no longer there, and she never would be again. The months that followed were the darkest of Ryan's life. He tried to maintain a routine, waking up early, going to the office, making important decisions, but everything seemed colorless, meaningless. He would come home to find Lucas, who was growing up too fast for someone who could barely keep up. Mrs. Peterson took over nearly all of the boy's care because Ryan, as much as he loved his son deeply, was drowning in a sadness that prevented him from being fully present. He would look at Lucas and see Jessica in every feature of his face, in every movement. It was both a comfort and a torture. The house, which once pulsed with life and joy, turned into a silent mausoleum. Ryan rarely had visitors, turned down invitations from friends, and isolated himself more and more. The company continued to run well, because he was too professional to let it sink, but any keen observer could see that something in him had been extinguished. The employees whispered about the change in their boss's behavior, about how he had become distant, almost unapproachable. Some tried to reach out with words of comfort, but Ryan kept everyone at a safe distance, unable to accept compassion when all he felt was an impossible void. Mrs. Peterson, for her part, took on the role no one else could fill. She cared for Lucas with absolute dedication, ensuring the boy had a routine, proper meals, regular baths, and affection. She sang to him, told him stories, and played with colorful toys scattered across the living room. Little Lucas grew up surrounded by love, but there was something everyone began to notice as time went on. He didn't speak. At 1.5, when most children were already babbling simple words like mama and dada, Lucas remained silent. He understood everything, responded to simple commands, pointed at what he wanted, but made no sounds other than crying when he was frustrated. Ryan initially thought it was just a normal developmental delay, that every child had their own pace. But when Lucas turned 2 and the silence persisted, the concern became impossible to ignore. The doctor's appointments started again. Pediatricians, speech therapists, child psychologists. They all ran thorough exams, tested his hearing, evaluated his reflexes, and administered detailed questionnaires. And they all came to the same baffling conclusion. Lucas was a perfectly healthy child. There was no physical problem to explain his mutism. Some specialists suggested it might be emotional, that the heavy atmosphere in the house could be affecting his speech development. Others mentioned similar cases where children simply took longer, with no clear explanation, and then one day suddenly began to speak normally. Ryan tried everything. He hired specialized therapists who visited the house 3 times a week to do exercises with Lucas. He bought educational toys that promised to stimulate speech. He even tried to force himself out of his own sadness to interact more actively with his son, hoping it would make a difference. But nothing changed. Lucas remained a quiet child who smiled occasionally, especially at Mrs. Peterson, but who lived in his own silent world. The years passed. Lucas turned 3, and the silence became a part of his identity. Ryan had gotten used to it in a way, though the worry never completely disappeared. Life continued in its melancholic rhythm. The company prospered, business expanded, but the house remained shrouded in a heavy atmosphere, as if everyone there were just going through the motions, surviving without truly living. It was then that Mrs. Peterson, with tears in her eyes, asked to speak with Ryan. She was over 65, and the weight of her years was finally starting to take its toll. Her legs didn't respond as they used to, her backaches were becoming more frequent, and she felt she could no longer keep up with an active child like Lucas. She announced, her voice trembling, that she needed to retire. She said she loved that family as if it were her own, that she had dedicated the best years of her life to that home, but the time had come for her to rest. Ryan, who had already lost so much, felt as if he were losing another important piece of his life. But he looked at the woman who had been so loyal, so dedicated, and understood that she deserved peace. He didn't just thank her for her years of service. He made a decision that surprised even Mrs. Peterson. He bought her a small house, paid in full and in her name, as a token of his gratitude for everything she had done for the Miller family. When she received the keys, she cried uncontrollably, hugged Ryan tightly and whispered that she would never forget them. She said goodbye to Lucas with kisses on his forehead, promising to visit often, and left, taking decades of memories with her. The house, already quiet, became even emptier. Ryan looked around and realized he was alone with a son who didn't speak, in a mansion too big for 2 lost souls. The hallways echoed his lonely footsteps, the rooms remained closed like time capsules, and the kitchen, once the vibrant heart of the home, where Jessica prepared recipes and Mrs. Peterson told stories while kneading dough, was now cold and impersonal. Lucas spent his days playing alone in the living room, moving toy cars back and forth without making the engine sounds other children did naturally, without inventing stories, without talking to his action figures. It was as if father and son were living in parallel dimensions within the same house. Ryan knew he needed help. There was no doubt about that. But the idea of bringing someone new into that space, someone who didn't know the family's history, who didn't understand the pain that permeated every room, seemed almost impossible. How could he explain to a stranger that the room at the end of the hall had been planned with so much love? How could he tell them that the rose bushes in the garden were planted by hands that no longer existed? How could he make someone understand that Lucas's silence wasn't just a medical condition, but a reflection of a house that had forgotten how to smile? For weeks, Ryan postponed the decision. He tried to manage on his own, hiring a cleaning lady who came twice a week and ordering takeout from local restaurants. But he soon realized it wasn't sustainable. Lucas needed constant attention, someone who was present not just physically, but emotionally. The company demanded his presence at important meetings that stretched for hours, occasional trips to close deals in other cities, and business dinners that were essential for maintaining contracts. He couldn't just abandon everything he had built, but he also couldn't let his son drift away. It was during a conversation with Robert, his business partner and longtime friend, that a solution began to take shape. Robert had been there for Ryan and Jessica from the beginning, was Lucas's godfather, and was one of the few people Ryan still allowed into his life. Over coffee at the company headquarters, Robert gently suggested that maybe it was time for Ryan to accept that he needed permanent professional help. Not just a cleaning lady or an occasional babysitter, but someone who could manage the house and care for Lucas, full-time. Ryan resisted at first. The idea of having someone living under the same roof, occupying the space where only he, Lucas, and the memories of Jessica resided, felt like an invasion. But Robert, with the patience of someone who truly cared, argued that it wasn't about replacing anyone, but about ensuring Lucas had what he needed, and that Ryan himself deserved a little peace to be able to reorganize his life. Reluctantly, Ryan gave in. He posted a discreet ad on specialized websites and in some local Stamford communities, looking for someone to handle household duties and assist with the care of a 3-year-old child with special attention needs. He was careful in the description, mentioning that it was a live-in position and would require full-time dedication. The responses started coming in, and Ryan scheduled interviews over the course of a week. The first candidate was an experienced older woman with excellent references, but she made it clear from the start that she didn't work in homes with children who had any kind of developmental delay. She said she didn't have the patience for special situations and preferred predictable routines. Ryan politely thanked her and ended the interview before they even finished their coffee. The second was too young, fresh out of her teens, with no experience whatsoever, who seemed more interested in the salary and the prospect of living in a large house than in the job itself. She spoke loudly, gestured excessively, and when Lucas appeared in the living room, she tried to interact so invasively that the boy ran to hide behind the sofa. Ryan knew it would never work. There were other equally frustrating interviews. A woman who smelled so strongly of cigarettes that Ryan was sure the entire house would be permeated with the odor. A man who seemed competent but let slip prejudiced comments about nonverbal children, suggesting it might be a problem of poor parenting. A young woman who spent the entire interview talking about her own personal problems, turning the meeting into an impromptu therapy session. Ryan was about to give up when, on a rainy July afternoon, as the Stamford sky was heavy with clouds and thunder, announced a coming storm, the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find a drenched young woman shivering from the cold, holding a broken umbrella that had clearly failed to do its job. She apologized profusely for being late, explaining that her bus had broken down and she had to walk several blocks in the downpour to make the interview. Ryan invited her in, offered her a towel, and made some hot tea while she dried off. There was something different about this young woman. In her eyes, despite her obvious youth, there was a depth that only comes from carrying burdens too heavy for one's age. When they finally sat down to talk, she told her story with a raw honesty that caught Ryan off guard. Still, life demanded practical solutions, and Ryan had to make a decision. Her name was Megan Clark. She was 23, and she carried a story on her shoulders that seemed to belong to someone much older. She began by saying she had grown up on the outskirts of Stamford, in a working-class neighborhood, in a simple but loving home. Her parents were humble, honest workers who never had much, but always made sure she had the essentials. Her father worked as a mechanic in a small shop, and her mother was a seamstress, doing alterations and repairs for neighbors. Megan was an only child, the pride and joy of that modest home. When she was 16, her father started showing strange symptoms: excessive fatigue, shortness of breath, chest pains. At first they thought it was just from overwork, but tests revealed a serious heart condition that would require long-term treatment and constant care. Megan, who was a junior in high school and dreamed of going to college to study education, had to make a painful choice. She dropped out of school to care for her father full-time, while her mother worked double shifts to support the family and pay for the expensive medications their health insurance plan didn't cover. Those were 3 difficult years. Megan learned to administer medications, recognize emergency signs, and cope with the frustration of watching someone she loved waste away. Her father, who had always been strong and cheerful, became a shadow of his former self. But she never complained, never showed resentment. She did everything with love, believing it was temporary, that he would eventually get better, and she could resume her own dreams. Then, as if fate decided to test her strength even further, Megan's mother also fell ill. It was an equally devastating diagnosis, discovered too late. At 20, Megan found herself caring for 2 sick parents alone, dividing her time between their rooms, administering different medications on a strict schedule, trying to keep hope alive even when everything seemed to be falling apart. Her friends drifted away as she no longer had time for anything beyond those 4 walls. Her dreams were tucked away in drawers of her memory that she opened less and less. Her father passed away first, on a quiet morning, in his sleep. Her mother held on for only a few more months. Megan went through it all in a state of shock that prevented her from fully processing the pain. She organized the funerals, accepted the condolences, and said goodbye to them both, trying to be strong. It was only when she returned to the empty house, where everything still smelled of medicine and shattered hopes, that reality hit her head-on. She was alone in the world. No close relatives, no financial resources, no direction. The debts from her parents' treatments were immense. Megan had to sell everything of value: furniture, appliances, even her mother's sewing machine, which was practically a family heirloom. It still wasn't enough. The landlord was demanding months of back rent and threatening eviction. She found a temporary job at a diner downtown, but the wages barely covered her own expenses. She was literally weeks away from being homeless. That's when she saw Ryan's ad. The possibility of a live-in job seemed like the answer to a prayer she didn't even know she had made. She applied immediately, but on the day of the interview, everything went wrong. The bus broke down, a torrential rain started, and her umbrella turned inside out in the wind. When she finally arrived at Ryan's house, she was soaked, late, and certain she had lost the opportunity. But Ryan didn't dismiss her because of her appearance or her tardiness. Something in her posture, in the way she apologized with genuine sincerity, caught his attention. He offered her comfort, made her tea, and listened to her story without interruption. Megan spoke about everything with disarming honesty, not trying to hide the difficult parts or embellish her situation. She said she had no formal professional experience in housekeeping, but she had spent years caring for people she loved, knew how to handle demanding routines, was organized, dedicated, and, most importantly, needed this opportunity more than anything. Ryan saw something in Megan that he recognized immediately: the silent pain of someone who had lost everything. This 23-year-old, who seemed to have lived a lifetime of sacrifice, reminded him, in a way, of himself. They were two people crumbling on the inside, trying to stay standing even when the ground had disappeared from beneath their feet. Without much thought, he made an impulsive decision. He told her the job was hers, that she could start immediately, and that there was a room available in the house where she could live while she got back on her feet. Megan looked at him with tears in her eyes, unable to believe what she was hearing. She tried to thank him, but the words came out jumbled, mixed with sobs of relief. Ryan just nodded, told her she could bring her things the next day, and that they would discuss the routine once she was settled. That night, Megan returned to her small rented room with a mix of hope and fear. Hope, because she finally had a way out of the hole she had fallen into. Fear, because it would be a complete new beginning in an unknown place, with people she wasn't sure she could adequately serve. But there was no alternative. She packed her few clothes into an old suitcase, gathered some personal items she had kept from her parents, and the next morning, she rang the doorbell of Ryan Miller's house again. The room he had prepared for her was on the ground floor near the kitchen. It was simple but cozy, with a twin bed, a built-in closet, a small desk, and a window overlooking the garden. Megan had never lived in a place so tidy, so clean, so peaceful. She put her things away carefully, organizing each drawer as if she feared it could all disappear at any moment. Ryan explained the house routine matter-of-factly. He left early for the office and usually didn't return until late afternoon. Lucas woke up around 7 in the morning and had specific meal times. There was a list of foods the boy would eat, as he was very selective about textures and flavors. His toys were kept organized in the living room, and therapists would come a few times a week to work with him. The house needed to be kept in order, but Ryan made it clear that Lucas was the absolute priority. Everything else could wait. Megan listened attentively, asking relevant questions, making mental notes. When Ryan finally took her to meet Lucas, her heart ached. The boy was sitting on the living room rug, stacking colorful wooden blocks into a precarious tower. He had straight brown hair, large, expressive eyes, and a seriousness on his face that didn't match his 3 years of age. When he noticed her presence, he stopped what he was doing and watched her with silent curiosity. Megan crouched down to his level, maintaining a respectful distance. She didn't try to force contact, didn't speak too loudly, didn't invade his space. She just smiled and said in a soft voice that her name was Megan, that she was going to help take care of him, and that she hoped they could be friends. Lucas continued to look at her for several long seconds, as if assessing whether he could trust this stranger. Then, slowly, he pushed one of the wooden blocks in her direction, a shy invitation to play along. Megan picked up the block and placed it carefully on top of the tower Lucas was building. The boy smiled faintly, approved of the addition, and continued stacking. It was a small, almost insignificant moment, but Ryan, watching from a distance, noticed that something different had happened. Lucas rarely accepted strangers so quickly. It usually took days, sometimes weeks, for him to get used to new people. But with Megan, in a matter of minutes, he had already established a connection. The first few days were an adjustment for everyone. Megan woke up before Ryan, prepared breakfast, and made sure the house was minimally organized before he had to leave. When Lucas woke up, she greeted him with patience, respecting his morning moods, letting him take his time to fully awaken. She prepared his breakfast exactly as Ryan had instructed, but gradually began to test small variations, introducing new foods slowly and carefully. What impressed Ryan the most was how Megan interacted with Lucas. She didn't treat his silence like a limitation or a problem to be solved. She talked to him normally, narrating what she was doing, asking questions without expecting verbal answers, but paying attention to his gestures, facial expressions, and the small cues Lucas gave. She created a routine of games that involved music, puppets, and picture books. She sang children's songs in a soft voice while preparing lunch, and Lucas, who usually remained indifferent to auditory stimuli, began to pay attention. One afternoon, while Megan was folding laundry in the utility room and humming an old song her mother used to sing, Lucas appeared at the door. He just stood there watching. She smiled at him and continued singing, gesturing for him to come closer. The boy came in, sat on the floor next to the basket of clean clothes, and stayed there for almost half an hour just listening. He made no sounds, didn't try to imitate her, but there was something different in his expression. A calmness, a presence that wasn't there before. If you were in Ryan's shoes, would you have hired Megan despite her lack of professional experience, just based on the connection she showed with Lucas? Let us know in the comments. As the weeks went by, the transformation in the house became more and more evident. The heavy atmosphere that had dominated every room began to dissipate. Megan had a habit of opening the windows in the morning, letting the sun in and freshening the air. She placed fresh flowers in vases around the house, always choosing the most colorful and fragrant ones. She cooked with spices that filled the kitchen with welcoming aromas. Slowly, the space that had felt like a mausoleum began to feel like a home again. Lucas changed visibly. He started smiling more often, especially when Megan was near. He actively sought her company, bringing her toys to show her, pulling her hand when he wanted her to play with him. He still wasn't speaking, but his attempts at communication became more elaborate. He pointed, gestured, and even tried to reproduce some sounds, though they didn't form recognizable words. The therapists who visited Lucas also noticed the difference. They commented to Ryan that the boy was more receptive, more engaged in the proposed activities, and more willing to try new things. They suggested that the positive environment was doing more for his development than any specific therapeutic technique. Ryan listened to it all and watched Megan with a mixture of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite identify yet. He himself, without consciously realizing it, was also changing. He started coming home earlier, not just because he had responsibilities with Lucas, but because he wanted to be there. Sometimes he would stand at the kitchen door, watching Megan prepare dinner while Lucas played on the floor beside her, and he would feel a pang of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't just comfort or convenience. It was that sense of belonging, that the house was once again a place worth being in. The conversations between Ryan and Megan, initially restricted to practical matters about the house routine and Lucas's needs, began to extend. After the boy was asleep, Ryan would sometimes stay in the kitchen while Megan tidied up for the day, and they would talk. They spoke about their losses, about how hard it was to keep going when everything seemed to be over, about the small things that still brought some meaning, even in the midst of pain. Megan had a way of listening that Ryan couldn't find in anyone else. She didn't try to fix him, didn't offer empty advice, didn't minimize his suffering. She just listened, nodded, and sometimes said something simple that somehow made sense. He, in turn, realized that she also needed to be heard. That behind the young woman who seemed so strong was A girl who never had the chance to be just a girl, who had been forced to grow up too fast, to carry responsibilities that weren't hers. There was a specific moment that marked an invisible but significant shift. It was a Sunday morning, and Ryan woke up later than usual. When he came down to the kitchen, he found Megan and Lucas making pancakes together. The boy was standing on a stool next to the stove, watching as she flipped the pancakes in the pan. The scene was so domestic, so naturally familiar, that Ryan stood frozen at the door for a few moments just watching. That's when Megan turned, saw him standing there and smiled. It wasn't a professional or polite smile. It was a genuine, warm smile that lit up her entire face. And in that instant, Ryan felt something stir inside his chest. It was as if a door he had locked years ago was beginning to creak open, letting in a sliver of light. He tried to ignore the feeling. He told himself it was just gratitude, that he was confusing relief with something deeper, that it would be completely inappropriate to develop any kind of feelings for someone who worked for him, who depended on him, who was there out of necessity. But feelings rarely obey logic, and the more time passed, the harder it became to pretend it was just professional. Megan, for her part, was also fighting something growing inside her. Every time Ryan came home and their eyes met for a few seconds longer than necessary, she felt her heart race. When he helped Lucas with a task, and she saw the tenderness he had for his son, even through all his pain, something inside her melted. But she constantly reminded herself of her position in that house, of the fact that Ryan had given her a chance when she was desperate, and that it would be a betrayal of his trust to let inappropriate feelings surface. So they both maintained an emotional distance. They were polite, cordial, respectful, but there was an unspoken tension in the air, something that hung between them whenever they were alone for more than a few minutes. It was as if the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, and then on a specific September night as the weather began to warm, heralding the arrival of fall, something changed. Lucas had woken up in the middle of the night from a nightmare. He didn't cry out loud, but he made small, distressed sounds that woke Megan, whose room was closest to his. She went to the boy's room, turned on the soft glow of the nightlight, and found him sitting up in bed, clutching the teddy bear he slept with every night. His little face was red, and tears were silently streaming down his cheeks. Megan sat on the edge of the bed and opened her arms. Lucas immediately threw himself into them, hiding his face in her shoulder, trembling slightly. She rocked him gently, humming the same lullaby her mother used to sing to her when she was a child and afraid of the dark. They stayed like that for several minutes, until the boy finally calmed down and his breathing returned to normal. That's when Ryan appeared at the door, also awakened by the sounds. He was wearing just a t-shirt and pajama pants. His hair was messy from sleep, and there was concern written all over his face. When he saw Megan holding Lucas, something in his expression shifted. It wasn't just gratitude. It was recognition. It was the awareness that this woman had become so much more than just an employee. She had become essential to his son's well-being, and, he had to admit to himself, to his as well. Megan looked at Ryan over Lucas's little head, and their gazes met in a silent exchange that lasted only a few seconds, but carried volumes of meaning. She no longer saw just the boss or the sad man who had hired her months ago. She saw a dedicated father, a man who was trying so hard to overcome his own pain to be present for his son, someone who deserved more than the loneliness in which he had imprisoned himself. Ryan approached and held out his arms to take Lucas. The boy moved from Megan's arms to his father's without resistance, but kept a small hand clutching the hem of her shirt, as if he needed the connection to both of them. Ryan nestled him against his chest, feeling the warm, comforting weight of his son, and whispered that everything was okay, that Daddy was here, that there was nothing to fear. Megan stood up, straightened the blankets on the bed, and as she turned to leave the room, Ryan lightly touched her arm. It was a brief, almost imperceptible touch, but it sent an electric current through her entire body. He just whispered a sincere, "Thank you." But there was something more in that gesture, in that look, in that shared moment in the middle of the night. She nodded and left the room, but her heart was pounding. She went back to her bed but couldn't fall asleep for hours, the sensation of his touch still vivid on her skin, the image of his gaze still etched in her mind. Ryan, for his part, laid Lucas back in bed and stayed there until the boy was fast asleep. But when he returned to his own room, he couldn't rest either. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still room in his life for something beyond pain. That maybe it wasn't a betrayal to let himself feel again. That maybe Jessica, wherever she was, would understand that he needed to keep living, not just surviving. In the days that followed, the dynamic between them subtly changed. There was more awareness in each interaction, more care in each word, more meaning in each gesture. But there was also fear. Fear of ruining the delicate balance they had achieved, fear of hurting each other, fear that any misstep could destroy everything that was being rebuilt in that house. Fall arrived, bringing with it not only colorful leaves and shorter days, but also complications no one had foreseen. The first came in the form of Veronica, a next-door neighbor, who had always shown an excessive interest in Ryan's life. She was a woman in her 40s, divorced, elegant, and with plenty of time to observe the goings-on in the neighborhood. Ever since Jessica had passed, Veronica had made frequent visits with various excuses, bringing homemade cakes, offering to help with Lucas, mentioning social events Ryan should attend to avoid complete isolation. When Megan came to live in the house, Veronica noticed immediately. She started asking subtle questions during her increasingly frequent visits. Who was this young woman? Was she a relative of Ryan's? Why was she living there? Wouldn't it be more appropriate to hire someone more experienced, perhaps older, to care for a child with special needs? Her questions were always wrapped in false concern, but it was obvious to anyone that she was bothered by the presence of a beautiful young woman living in the same house as Ryan. Megan felt Veronica's appraising gaze whenever she saw her. She felt the weight of silent judgment, the veiled insinuations about her age, her appearance, her position in that house. She began to feel uncomfortable, questioning whether it was really appropriate for her to be there. Ryan noticed the change in her behavior, how she withdrew whenever Veronica appeared, and it irritated him deeply. One afternoon, when Veronica showed up unannounced with another cake no one had asked for, he finally set clear boundaries. He thanked her politely but made it very clear that Megan was a competent professional, was doing an exceptional job, and that he would not tolerate disrespectful comments about her or his personal choices. Veronica left offended, but the gossip had already started to spread through the neighborhood. Some people commented disapprovingly on how quickly Ryan had brought a young woman to live in his house. Others speculated about the nature of their relationship. There were those who said it was inappropriate, that he was taking advantage of her vulnerability, that it wasn't a good example for Lucas. The conversations happened in whispers at the grocery store, at the gym, in the cafes frequented by the upper-middle-class circles of Stamford. Some of the wives of important clients began to decline invitations to business dinners at Ryan's house, citing discomfort with the situation. Others made veiled comments about how men always took advantage of young, needy girls. What those people didn't see or chose not to see was the reality inside that house. Nothing improper was happening. Megan worked with exemplary professionalism. Ryan maintained clear boundaries, and all that existed between them was an emotional connection that both were actively trying to suppress. But the rumors continued to grow, fueled by people with their own agendas or simply nothing better to do than speculate about others' lives. Megan began to feel the weight of these judgments whenever she had to leave the house for errands or appointments related to Lucas. She noticed curious glances, conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached, forced smiles that didn't reach the eyes. On one particularly uncomfortable occasion, while waiting for Lucas to finish a therapy session, she overheard two women in the waiting room discussing a story that was clearly about her and Ryan, though they didn't mention names. They said it was obvious the girl was after the boss's money, that she was probably smarter than she looked, that she had taken advantage of his emotional fragility to secure a comfortable life. The words cut deep. Megan left with Lucas and cried the entire car ride home. When they arrived and Ryan asked if she was okay, she said she was just tired. But that night, locked in her room, she seriously questioned whether she should stay. Maybe it would be better for everyone if she found another job, another place to live. Even if it meant returning to insecurity, at least she wouldn't be the target of cruel gossip, wouldn't be jeopardizing Ryan's reputation or Lucas's emotional well-being. Robert, Ryan's partner, also started making comments. In a meeting at the office, he pulled his friend aside for a private conversation and asked if he was aware of the speculation. He said some people were questioning Ryan's professionalism, suggesting he might be confusing gratitude with something more. Robert wasn't being malicious. He was genuinely concerned for his friend's well-being, but his words planted seeds of doubt that Ryan tried to ignore but couldn't completely forget. Inside the house, the tension grew differently. Ryan and Megan continued to maintain physical distance, but their emotional proximity became increasingly undeniable. There were moments when their eyes met and stayed connected for seconds that felt like eternities. There were conversations that stretched late into the night, where they shared fears, dreams, and reflections on life and its random cruelties. There were accidental touches that sent electric shocks through them both, hands brushing as they passed a plate, shoulders touching as they simultaneously bent to pick up something Lucas had dropped. Ryan was completely torn. On one hand, he felt something growing inside him that he could no longer deny. Ryan wasn't just her employer or the father of the child she cared for. He was a man who saw her as a person, who valued her opinions, who talked to her as an equal, who showed vulnerability without fear of seeming weak. He made her feel important in a way no one ever had. When he asked about her day, he actually listened to the answers. When she commented on a news story or offered an opinion on any subject, he considered her words seriously. He never made her feel inferior for her lack of formal education or her humble background. He treated her with genuine respect, and that meant more to her than anyone on the outside could understand. But on the other hand, there was the weight of her position, the age difference that, while not huge, was significant enough to fuel gossip, the social chasm that separated them, and above all, the fear that she was misinterpreting the whole situation. Megan came from a reality where wealthy men rarely saw women like her as anything more than service or convenience. Her mother had worked her whole life for affluent families and had always warned her to maintain clear boundaries, not to confuse kindness with real interest. What if she was doing exactly that? What if she was building fantasies because the alternative was to accept that she would be forever alone, taking care of other people's lives without ever truly having one of her own? What if Ryan was just being kind because she was a good professional? What if those prolonged glances were just a product of her imagination, desperate for connection? What if she was building a castle of fantasies on gestures that meant nothing more than cordiality? The possibility of having misinterpreted everything and ending up humiliated, or worse, losing the place that had become her refuge terrified her. Ryan faced equally intense conflicts. Every night, after Megan had retired to her room and he was finally alone, he argued with himself. Was it too soon? Jessica had been gone for only 3 years. Would it be a betrayal to let himself feel something for someone else so quickly? He loved Jessica. He always would. That would never change. But he was beginning to understand that love wasn't a finite resource, that it was possible to honor the past while opening up to the future. Still, there was the practical problem. Megan worked for him, depended on him financially, lived in his house. Any move toward her could be interpreted as an abuse of power, as taking advantage of her vulnerability. How could he be sure she felt something genuine for him, and not just misinterpreted gratitude or worse, a sense of obligation? Besides, there was Lucas to consider. The boy had formed such a strong bond with Megan that Ryan feared what might happen if things between them didn't work out. If a relationship started and ended badly, Megan would probably have to leave, and Lucas would lose another important mother figure in his life. The boy had already lost so much. Was it fair to risk causing him more pain? While they both struggled with their internal conflicts, Lucas continued his surprising development. The therapists were impressed with his progress. Although he still wasn't speaking, he was trying to imitate sounds more frequently. His language comprehension had taken impressive leaps, and his ability to express himself through gestures and facial expressions was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The lead therapist, Dr. Evans, an experienced woman who had worked with non-verbal children for over 15 years, commented to Ryan that she had never seen such a significant transformation in such a short time. During a particularly revealing session, she asked to speak with Ryan alone. She said she believed Lucas's mutism had never been purely physical or neurological. It was, in her professional opinion, predominantly emotional. The child had grown up in a house steeped in sadness, where the most important adult in his life was emotionally absent, lost in his own grief. Lucas somehow had absorbed that pain and turned it into silence. It was as if he had unconsciously decided that his words were not necessary or welcome in such a heavy world. But now the house was different. There was joy again. There were laughs. There was a female presence that brought lightness and unconditional love. Lucas was rediscovering emotional security, and with it, the barriers that prevented his speech were beginning to crumble. The doctor made sure to emphasize that there were no guarantees that every child had their own timeline, but that she was optimistic. There was something in him that suggested speech was close, like a fruit about to ripen. Perhaps all that was missing was a trigger, a specific moment when everything would connect at once. In mid-October, an incident occurred that accelerated everything. Ryan had to travel to New York City for a series of important meetings that would last 2 days. It was the first time he would leave Lucas completely in Megan's care for an extended period. He was hesitant, not because he doubted her ability, but because he had never been separated from his son for so long since Jessica had passed. Megan sensed his anxiety, and the night before the trip sat with Ryan in the living room after Lucas was asleep. She said she understood his fears perfectly, that she would be worried too in his place, but she promised to take care of the boy as if he were her own. There would be constant communication. She would send photos and videos throughout the day and call if anything seemed out of the ordinary. Ryan thanked her, but there was something more he wanted to say, words that got stuck in his throat, an almost irresistible impulse to just confess what he felt, but he held back. He thanked her formally, went over last-minute instructions she already knew by heart, and went upstairs to pack. Megan stayed there, alone in the dark living room, feeling an inexplicable sadness tighten her chest. The 2 days Ryan was away were strange. The house felt different without his presence. Megan cared for Lucas with her usual dedication, but there was a sense of incompleteness in the air. She sent messages and photos constantly, and Ryan replied immediately, always anxious for news. During their nightly calls, to say goodnight to Lucas, their conversation would extend after the boy was asleep, both of them looking for excuses to stay connected. It was during one of these calls that Megan, without thinking, let something slip that she had been holding back. She commented on how empty the house felt without him, how even Lucas kept looking at the door, waiting for his father to arrive. And then, in a lower voice, almost a whisper, she added that she missed him too. There was a silence on the other end of the line that seemed to last an eternity. Then Ryan, his voice thick with emotion, said that he missed them too. Not just Lucas, but the routine, the house, and yes, her too. That mutual, albeit veiled, confession changed something between them. It was as if they had finally admitted there was something there beyond a professional relationship, even if they didn't know exactly what to do with that information yet. When Ryan finally returned from his trip, it was a Friday night. He arrived later than expected, around 10 o'clock, assuming Megan would already be in her room, but she was in the living room, with only the soft light of a lamp on, reading a book while she waited. She said she wanted to make sure he got back safely, that she wouldn't be able to sleep until she saw him safe and sound. Ryan dropped his suitcase on the floor, and for a moment just looked at her. Megan stood up from the sofa, and they stood there a few feet apart, with so much unsaid between them that the air felt thick. It was Ryan who took the first step, literally, walking toward her with an expression that mixed determination and vulnerability. He began to speak, his voice low but firm. He said he had spent the last few months trying to ignore something growing inside him, that he had convinced himself it would be wrong, inappropriate, premature. But during those 2 days away, he had realized something fundamental. Life was too short, painfully short, and wasting it out of fear was the real betrayal. Not a betrayal of Jessica, but a betrayal of himself, of the possibility of being happy again. Megan listened, tears forming in her eyes. When he paused, she began to speak too. She said she was scared. So scared. Of misinterpreting everything. That it was just gratitude mistaken for something more. Of ruining everything good in that house. But she couldn't pretend anymore that she didn't feel anything. That she didn't wake up every day hoping to see him. That she didn't find herself thinking about him at the most random moments. Ryan reached out and, hesitantly, lightly touched her face. Megan closed her eyes at his touch, and a tear finally escaped. He wiped it away with his thumb and whispered that they didn't have to rush anything. That they could go slow, discover together what this was, and where it could lead. But that he couldn't deny any more that he wanted to find out. Megan opened her eyes and met his gaze, so intense, so vulnerable, so honest. And for the first time since she had arrived at that house, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere, not as a housekeeper, not as an employee, but as someone who mattered, who was seen, who was wanted not out of necessity, but by choice. They didn't kiss that night. It was too soon, too fragile, too important to be rushed. But they stood there holding each other's hands, finally acknowledging what was between them, allowing themselves to feel without guilt and without fear. From the room next to the living room, Lucas, who was supposed to be asleep, had woken up to the sound of low voices. He quietly approached the slightly ajar door and watched, his big, attentive eyes taking in every detail of the scene. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but something in the air had changed. The whole house seemed to breathe differently, and inside his little heart something began to stir, as if a knot that had been holding his words back was finally starting to unravel. The weeks following that night were a time of careful reconstruction. Ryan and Megan didn't make any dramatic announcements or sudden changes. They continued their routines, but now there was a mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement that they were exploring something new, something fragile and precious that deserved to be handled with care. They stole moments together after Lucas was asleep, talking for hours about everything and nothing, sharing old dreams and renewed hopes. Megan stopped questioning her place in that house so much. She began to allow herself to belong, not out of necessity, but by choice. She decorated her room with small personal touches she had previously avoided, started offering her opinion on household decisions without asking for permission, and took up her space more confidently. Ryan, in turn, opened up in ways he hadn't since Jessica had passed. He talked about her without paralyzing pain, shared happy memories, and acknowledged that loving Megan didn't mean forgetting or betraying his first love. They were different things, equally valid, that could coexist in his heart. The most significant change, however, was in Lucas. The boy, always perceptive despite his silence, clearly felt the difference. In the air. The house that had been heavy and tense for so long now breathed with lightness. Daddy smiled more. Megan hummed while she worked. There were spontaneous hugs, genuine laughter, a sense of family that he may have never consciously experienced, but recognized on some deep level. November brought warmer days and with them a series of small milestones. Lucas began trying to imitate specific words. They weren't clear or complete, but they were unmistakably attempts at verbal communication. He would say something that sounded like dada when Ryan came home from work. He tried to reproduce, bawl when he saw one. Dr. Evans was ecstatic, saying the final breakthrough was near, that it would likely happen suddenly and naturally. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Ryan decided to do something he hadn't done in years, a family picnic at Cove Island Park. They made sandwiches together in the kitchen, Ryan and Megan working side by side while Lucas watched from his stool, passing them ingredients when asked. There was a domesticity to the scene that warmed the hearts of everyone involved. At the park, they spread a blanket under a large leafy tree. Lucas ran across the grass, chased pigeons, and laughed when Ryan picked him up and spun him around. Megan took pictures with her old phone, capturing moments she wanted to keep forever. They ate sandwiches that tasted of simple happiness, drank from juice boxes, and watched other families around them living their own stories. It was in that moment, watching Lucas play carefree while Megan packed up the picnic leftovers, that Ryan felt an absolute certainty. It didn't matter what people said. It didn't matter what society deemed appropriate or convenient. He loved this woman. He loved her strength, her kindness, her ability to rebuild herself. even after losing everything. He loved how she cared for Lucas, how she had brought life back to a dead house, how she made him feel human again. That night, after they put Lucas to bed together, reading a story about dragons and princesses that the boy adored, Ryan asked Megan to sit with him on the living room sofa. There was something in his expression that made her heart race. He took her hands in his and began to speak, his voice thick with emotion. He said he knew this had started unconventionally, that they might never follow the patterns the world expected. But he didn't care anymore. That in the last few months he had rediscovered what it meant to be alive, not just existing day after day, but genuinely living. And it was all because of her. He asked if she would be willing to turn what they had into something official, if she would accept not just continuing to live there, but building a real life with him as a partner, as an equal, as the person he chose to be with. Tears were streaming down Megan's face. She tried to speak, but the words came, words out-jumbled, so she just nodded vigorously, laughing and crying at the same time. Ryan pulled her into a tight hug, and for the first time, they allowed themselves a kiss. It was soft, almost shy, but filled with the promise of possible futures, of deserved new beginnings, of a love built on rubble that was finally turning into a solid foundation. The days that followed were a period of adjustment. Ryan spoke with Robert, making it clear he would no longer tolerate comments about Megan, and that any client who had a problem with his personal choices could take their business elsewhere. Robert, seeing his friend's determination and recognizing that Ryan was genuinely happy for the first time in years, became an ally. He helped dispel rumors, defended the couple when necessary, and gradually, the gossip began to fade. Megan officially stopped being an employee. Ryan insisted it was no longer appropriate to see her that way. She was his partner and deserved to be treated as such. They hired a housekeeper who came a few days a week to help with the heavy cleaning. But Megan continued to cook because she enjoyed it and continued to care for Lucas because she loved him. But now it was by choice, not obligation. The most beautiful change of all, however, was yet to come. It was an ordinary December morning, a few days before Christmas. Megan was in the kitchen making breakfast, humming along to a Christmas carol on the radio. Ryan had left early to take care of some business at the office before the holidays. Lucas woke up, came downstairs with his teddy bear dragging on the floor, and sat at the kitchen table with his characteristic morning sleepiness. Megan lovingly prepared his plate, pancakes with syrup, just the way he liked them, cut into small pieces. She placed the plate on the table and turned to get juice from the refrigerator. That's when she heard it. A small voice, clear as crystal, breaking 3 years of silence. "Mommy, sit here with me today?" The platter Megan was holding slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. She turned around slowly, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Lucas was looking at her with those big, expressive eyes, waiting for an answer, as if he hadn't just done the most extraordinary thing. Megan, her hands trembling, ignored the broken glass on the floor and rushed to him. She knelt beside his chair and held his little face in her hands. "You talked," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You talked, my love." Lucas smiled, that special smile he reserved only for important moments. "Mommy," he repeated, testing the word, savoring it. "I want you to sit here." Megan's tears were falling freely now. She pulled him into a tight hug, covering his little head with kisses, laughing and crying at the same time. It wasn't just the first word that mattered, though that alone was a miracle. It was which word he had chosen. It was who he had chosen to say it to. With trembling hands, Megan picked up her phone and called Ryan, who answered on the first ring. When she finally managed to tell him what had happened, she heard him gasp on the other end of the line. He said he was coming home immediately, that the meeting he was about to start didn't matter, that nothing in the world was more important than this moment. Ryan got home in record time and found Megan still, kneeling beside Lucas, who was now calmly eating his pancakes as if he hadn't just revolutionized their world. When he saw his father, Lucas looked up and said, with that surprising naturalness, "Hi, Daddy. Mommy made pancakes." Ryan felt his legs go weak. He leaned on the table and just stood there looking at his son, the boy who had carried such a heavy silence for so long, now speaking as if he had always been able to. He knelt beside Megan and held out his arms. Lucas threw himself into them, and the three of them stayed there hugging, crying tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude for this moment that had seemed impossible but had finally arrived. "What are you feeling, champ?" Ryan asked when he finally found his voice. Lucas thought for a moment, his characteristic seriousness returning to his face. "I'm happy, Daddy. Our house is happy now." Those simple words held a profound truth that Ryan and Megan recognized immediately. The house was happy, not just the adults who had found love after loss, but also the child who finally felt safe enough to express himself. Lucas hadn't spoken before because there was nothing worth saying in a world of sadness. But now, in a home filled with love and hope, his words finally had a place to exist. The days that followed were filled with constant discoveries. Lucas never stopped talking. It was as if 3 years of dammed-up words had finally found an outlet. He told stories about his toys, asked questions about everything, sang songs he had learned silently, and expressed opinions about food, clothes, and games. His personality, once hidden behind silence, blossomed spectacularly. Dr. Evans, when she heard the news, was not so much surprised as she was moved. She said there were cases like this in medical literature, children who remained nonverbal, not due to physical inability, but due to a lack of emotional motivation to communicate. Lucas had finally found not only the security, but also the happiness that made speech not just possible, but necessary. He had things to say, feelings to express, and now he had an environment that welcomed his words with love. Christmas that year was special in a way none of them could have predicted. They decorated the house together, with Lucas enthusiastically giving his opinion on where each ornament should go. They prepared Christmas dinner as a family, Ryan chopping vegetables while Megan seasoned the meat and Lucas, standing on his stool, helped mix the stuffing. There was music playing, laughter echoing through the halls, and the smell of home-cooked food filling every room. On Christmas night, after Lucas fell asleep, exhausted from all the excitement, Ryan and Megan sat in the living room, lit only by the lights of the tree. He pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, just appreciating the peace of the moment. 3 years ago, Ryan whispered, I was convinced my life was over, that all I had left was to survive day by day until the pain finally stopped. Megan took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. And now? Now, he said, turning to look into her eyes. Now I know that life doesn't end when we lose someone. It transforms, and if we have the courage to open ourselves up to what comes next, we can find something just as beautiful as what we had before. Different, but just as valuable. You taught me that, Megan said softly. You and Lucas. You showed me that there's always a chance for a new beginning, even when everything seems lost. We taught each other, Ryan corrected. The three of us. We were 3 broken people who somehow found a way to fit together, to complete each other, to heal each other. They kissed under the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree, a kiss that sealed not just the present, but all the promises of the future. A future they would build together, not as employer and employee, not as strangers united by circumstance, but as a chosen family, as life partners, as people who had learned that the most powerful love is the one that rises from the ashes of pain. In the months that followed, life continued its natural course. Lucas flourished in unimaginable ways, becoming a talkative, curious, and loving child. He started school and made friends quickly. His vocabulary expanded daily, and he never returned to silence. He had found his voice and, with it, his place in the world. Ryan and Megan married in a small, intimate ceremony early the next year, with only close friends and family. Lucas was the ring-bearer, carrying the rings with adorable seriousness. When the officiant asked if there were any objections to the marriage, Lucas raised his hand and said with complete conviction, I have no objection, I want them to get married. The entire chapel erupted in laughter and tears. Megan never forgot her roots, never lost the humility that defined her. She went back to school, got her degree in education as she had always dreamed, and became an early childhood teacher. Ryan supported her every step of the way, proud of the extraordinary woman she was and continued to become. The house in Stamford, which had for so long been a mausoleum of painful memories, was completely transformed. It was a living, breathing home, full of the sounds of a child, laughter, silly arguments about what movie to watch, and the smells of home cooking. The rose bushes that Jessica had planted continued to bloom in the garden, and Megan cared for them tenderly, recognizing that those flowers were part of the family's history, bridges between the past and present that deserved to be honored. Ryan never erased the memories of Jessica. There were pictures of her around the house, stories he told Lucas about the mother who had given birth to him, a constant acknowledgement that she would always be a part of them. And Megan never felt threatened by this. She understood that love wasn't a competition, that there was room in Lucas's heart to love the memory of his biological mother and the presence of the mother who was raising him. She understood that Ryan's love for her didn't diminish the love he had felt for Jessica. They were different chapters of the same life, equally important, equally valid. Mrs. Peterson visited them regularly, always emotional to see Lucas talking non-stop, always delighted by the transformation of the family she had helped build. She would say that she knew from the day she met a rain-soaked Megan that the young woman had been sent by higher powers to heal that house. And maybe she was right. Maybe there was something divine, something fated, in the way three broken lives found each other exactly when they needed each other most. Or maybe it was simply the stubborn persistence of human love, its ability to sprout in the most barren soil, to find light in the deepest darkness. In the end, it didn't matter which explanation was correct. What mattered was that Ryan had rediscovered his capacity to love, to open up, to build a future. Megan had found not just a place to live, but a place to belong, a family that chose her as much as she chose them. And Lucas had found his voice, both literally and metaphorically, learning that it was safe to express himself, that his words were valuable, that he was loved unconditionally. A house that once held only shadows and silence began to breathe again. And life, once more, proved its most fundamental thesis. Even after the greatest losses, even when it seems like everything is over, there is always room for a new beginning. There is always the possibility of rebuilding. There is always hope that better days will come, as long as we have the courage to open ourselves up to them. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Ryan, Megan, and Lucas has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of loss, reconstruction, and love, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you the most. Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul and showing that there is always hope, even in the most difficult times. We'll see you in the next episode.